vote counting process. We will check in with some of them tonight.
Yeah, we're also joined by a roundtable of local political experts. News4JAX political analyst and executive director of the Jacksonville University Public Policy Institute, Rick Mullaney, is with us. Government law attorney and author Chris Hand, also a former chief of staff in the city of Jacksonville, and then local pastor and political contributor John Newman. So we're going to speak with all of you in just a few moments.
And we'll be talking with two members of Gen Z, both college students at the University of North Florida. Amelia Shepard and Katie Renzi will give us their perspectives on how younger voters are viewing this election.
All right, so we want to begin tonight, start with a look at some of those key events over the past 4 months or so, events that really shook up this race for president.
June 27th, President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump met for their first and what turned out to be only debate of the 2024 election cycle. Mr. Biden's performance that night led to questions about the future of his candidacy.
A little more than 2 weeks later, July 13th, Mr. Trump was speaking at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, when he was injured in a shooting that the FBI says was an assassination attempt. And just 2 days later, July 15th, the Republican National Convention began. That was in Milwaukee. And in the early hours of the convention, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance was named as the ticket's vice presidential nominee.
The Sunday after the RNC, July 21st, President Biden announced he would end his re-election campaign among growing concerns that a Democratic victory was slipping away. The same afternoon, he backed Vice President Kamala Harris to replace him as the nominee. On August 5th, Harris officially clinched her party's nomination through a virtual roll call vote conducted by the Democrats. The next morning, Harris named Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her vice presidential pick, marking the final piece of the two major party presidential tickets.
Joining us now from Washington is Julia Benbrook. She's been our election correspondent for months now from D.C. and all along the campaign trail.
So, Julia, where are the candidates spending their time on this last day before the election?
Well, it's no surprise. We've been talking for the last few weeks now about their focus on these battleground states, and that's exactly where they are today. Harris is in Pennsylvania, the swing state with the biggest electoral prize up for grabs, and Trump made stops in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Michigan.
Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump are using the last hours before Election Day to make their final pitches to voters.
America is ready for a fresh start. Ready for a new way forward where we see our fellow American not as an enemy, but as a neighbor.
Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? With your vote tomorrow, I will end inflation. I will stop the invasion of criminals coming into our country.
While a historic switch-up at the top of the Democratic ticket led Harris to run an accelerated campaign.
We are going to win. I do believe that.
This is Trump's third time as the Republican nominee.
We're going to defeat Kamala Harris, and we're going to win back that beautiful White House.
The race for the 270 electoral votes needed to win will likely come down to a handful of battleground states. Then there's the balance of power on Capitol Hill, with tight races for control of both chambers. In the House, currently controlled by Republicans, all 435 seats are on the ballot.
We're still have a pathway to grow the majority, but we'll see how things play out. There's just a lot of races that are really close.
In the Senate, currently controlled by Democrats, roughly a third of the 100 seats are up for grabs.
I believe we're going to hold our majority, but it will be close. It's going to go right down to the wire.
The 2024 presidential race will probably not be called on election night because the counting of ballots in some of those battleground states could take several days. Now, in 2020, Joe Biden was declared the winner on Saturday, and that was a few days after election night. And while those votes were still being counted, Trump falsely claimed victory and alleged his opponents were perpetrating fraud. Now, Trump has already made several baseless claims on the campaign trail, leading some to be concerned that we could end up in a similar situation. Live at the White House, Julia Benbrook, Channel 4, the local station.
And Julia, Vice President Harris and former President Trump, they've had very different closing messages here. What have their final days on the trail looked like?
Well, one thing that has been similar about their messages is that they're both presenting themselves as the candidate who can bring change to the White House. Harris is presenting herself as a new generation of leadership, a step forward, while Trump is asking his crowds if they're happy with the way things have gone over the last 4 years. His crowds normally respond no. He blames anything that's gone wrong over the last 4 years on the Biden administration and therefore on the vice president. Now, as far as their tones go, Harris has really leaned into this positive, forward-thinking type of message, while Trump has leaned into a little bit darker rhetoric in these last few days. Instead of focusing on where the polls gives him the upper hand, he's been leaning in to some baseless conspiracies and then also saying that he shouldn't have left the White House in 2020 after his defeat.
Julia Benbrook reporting for us tonight. Thank you so much. Well, tomorrow night, all eyes will be on these 7 swing states that are expected to decide the outcome of the race for president.
Yeah, so here are those states where the presidential candidates they've been spending most of their time over the last few weeks. They are Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. You may remember 4 years ago, so close in Georgia that Joe Biden wasn't certified as the winner for several weeks after 2 recounts. John Acebus joins us now with a look at how some of the key counties in Georgia performed 4 years ago.
After Donald Trump won in Georgia in 2016 by more than 200,000 votes, it went blue for the first time historically in nearly 30 years in 2020 when Joe Biden won the state by fewer than 12,000 votes. Let's just look at the razor-thin margin here. It was 11,779 votes between the two candidates out of the more than 4.9 million votes. So Georgia looms large, and we're going to focus on some of the key areas starting in the Atlanta area. Fulton County, this is where most of your votes are going to come from. In 2020, more than 500,000 people voted. Biden took 72.6% of those votes, and the difference was 242,000. This is going to be especially important on election night, as are the suburb areas in this area. It's one of these heavily black populations, and that's the demographic, quite honestly, that both candidates are after. We're going to move down to Clayton County. It doesn't have the amount of votes or amount of people that a community like Fulton County has, but it's just as important. In 2020, Biden took 85% of the votes. The difference between the candidates, nearly 80,000 votes out of the more than 112,000 votes. Democrats improved there over their 2016 margin of victory. So a key to victory for them is maintaining their 2020 strength. Now here's Muskogee County. This will also loom large, another black demographic and a part of the historic Black Belt, which basically stands for the black soil and the slaves years ago who worked these areas. So Columbus area and Muskogee area, this looms large for the demographic that both candidates are going after. In 2020, you see that Biden won this state or this county with 61% of the votes. The difference, nearly 20,000. These 80,000 votes in 2020 loomed large and could do the same thing here in 2024. So I also want to point out a couple of other red counties. We're going to come up here to Bartow County. Trump won this in 74% of the votes. This is going to loom large, right? He's going to want to win these rural areas as he does, as well as these suburbs. So Bartow County is going to loom large. And then coming over here to Carroll County, another county that he did extremely well in. Again, took 68% of the votes, nearly 69%. The difference here, 21,000 votes. So the difference in those votes are going to loom large. In 2020, again, he did really well in this area. He's going to look to capitalize. Tomorrow, we will be breaking down these counties as well as many other counties around the country. Stay with News4JAX for our continued coverage.
Thank you. We want to bring our roundtable into the conversation now. You know, we've seen Georgia go in favor of the Democrats with the presidential election in 2020 and 3 Senate elections in 2020 and 2022. So will their momentum keep up, or will the state tilt back to the Republicans? Rick Mullaney, your thoughts?
Well, remember this. During that same time, you had a very popular Republican governor in Brian Kemp and also a popular Secretary of State. And so it has truly trended purple. And this state could go either way. And you're going to see this theme tomorrow night. In those big urban areas, whether it's going to be Atlanta or later on Pittsburgh and Philadelphia or Phoenix, that's going to be advantage Kamala Harris. When you go to those rural areas, that's going to be advantage Donald Trump. One interesting thing to note is that 4 million people have already voted in Georgia, and you'll get those results, about 70% of them, just after 8 o'clock tomorrow night, to give you a little bit of an indicator. But let me say this. A poll over the weekend from the New York Times saying it'll put Kamala Harris 1 percentage point up. Other polls have it a little bit favoring Donald Trump. It is clearly jump ball. If Kamala Harris wins Georgia, it is a very serious blow for Donald Trump. It narrows the pathway. So although there's 7 states, Kamala Harris is playing very competitive in Georgia, a state that has historically been Republican, but trending purple. It could go her way. If it does, long night for Donald Trump. If Trump wins it, then he has some other combinations that could take him potentially to 270.
Yeah, Chris, when we look at Georgia, I compare it with Florida. A few years ago, Florida was that toss-up, that jump ball state. What's changed in Georgia over the last few years?
Well, as you say, Kent, Georgia is the new Florida, whereas every election was a nail-biter here in the Sunshine State for many years. That's really become the Georgia pattern. And I think one huge factor is the massive growth of the Atlanta area. It's obviously one of the biggest metropolitan areas in the country, rapidly changing, rapidly diversifying. John just sort of went through some of those key Georgia counties. There are 3 that I'm going to be particularly watching on election night. That's Forsyth County, Cobb County, and Gwinnett County. All the northern Atlanta suburbs, which have been trending much more blue in recent years. Donald Trump has actually spent some time, particularly in Gwinnett County, trying to keep those margins down. The Harris-Walz campaign has done the same. So while the entire state's important, I'm going to be very focused on those northern Atlanta suburbs. As that metro area grows, becomes more politically diverse, that is what has driven Georgia as a new swing state.
Yeah. John, what do you think about Georgia?
I think you also have to pay attention to DeKalb County as well, which is on the periphery of the Atlanta metropolitan area, or included in the metropolitan area. But also, in addition to that, there are a couple of benchmarks. One is the Stacey Abrams number when she ran for governor, which is 1.9 million. It's not going to be enough. The other is Joe Biden's number, 2.5, when he ran in one state. So the word I'm getting on the ground is they've surpassed Stacey's number, but now they're waiting to see if they can go past Biden's come election day tomorrow.
So all about, as we always hear, all about turnout.
All about turnout.
I say what we've seen is that people are engaged in Georgia because, according to the Secretary of State's office, as of Friday, more than half of registered voters in Georgia had already voted. I would say that's pretty telling that these voters are engaged in Georgia. Thoughts?
Well, there's a lot of excitement. And to put that in some perspective, they have smashed early voting records. That 4 million number you just cited, Ashley, that is double the number of Georgians who voted early just 4 years ago in 2020. So huge interest in these elections. I think they're on track to have probably a record turnout in that state. And I think it is a state that has begun to take very seriously its status as one of the key swing states. So citizens are engaged. Candidates and surrogates spending a lot of time there. This could be an election where so goes Georgia, so goes the White House.
Interesting that part of our viewing area, obviously 6 counties in southeast Georgia, obviously, we're going to be watching every county in the Peach State there as we go forward. Thank you very much. We'll have more to speak with you all about as we go forward, and much more to come on our Vote 2024 special, The Road to the White House.
Next, we talk with Duval County Supervisor of Elections Jerry Holland about what his team has been doing this election season and what they've faced in a heated election year.
Tomorrow, 160 precincts around Duval County will be open for Election Day voting between 7 in the morning and 7 p.m.
And this comes after 2 weeks of early in-person voting, in addition to mail-in voting. Going into Election Day, turnout in Duval County is nearly 55%, with more than 355,000 voters casting a ballot. So joining us now is Duval County Supervisor of Elections, Jerry Holland. Thanks so much for being with us tonight. Well, sorry, go ahead.
Jerry, I was just going to say, we wanted to hear from you what voters need to know as they get ready to go to the polls tomorrow.
Well, a couple things. One is make sure you bring your ID. The most common is the driver's license. But again, in the state of Florida, if you don't have an ID, you'll still be able to vote provisional. So don't let it keep you from coming to the polls. The other thing, this is a long ballot, a 17-inch ballot, front and back. If you're at Atlantic Beach, you've actually got 2 full pages, 3. And so be prepared. Bring your sample ballot with you. And the last thing is know where your precinct is. We've changed precincts since the last presidential election, reduced from 186 to 160. So your precinct could have changed. Don't wait till 6:45 and go looking for it. Call us if you need help.
Absolutely. So, Jerry, in the last few weeks, we've seen how tense things can get around voting. We heard about the teenager at the library and at the beaches communities during early voting, and also charged with voter intimidation. We also know that you received a death threat. What impact has all of this had leading up to Election Day, would you say?
It adds a lot more tension for the workers. I even had one worker, one of my staff members, have to go to the hospital, stress-related heart condition. Is good now, everything's fine, but it puts a lot of pressure on those workers. I've got 1,800 staff members counting the poll workers, and I don't think I've ever seen it as contentious as it is for these workers and the stress they go through.
Yeah, and poll workers, I mean, so many of them saying, I just do this because I want to be part of the process. I believe in democracy, all of those sorts of things, right?
Oh, they're dedicated. Some of them have done it for decades. Love the process, love the excitement of the elections. But also, what we miss now is we used to see the voters, no matter which side of the aisle they were on, talking and cheerful as they go into the polls. Now it's like, who's my enemy? Who's gonna, watching, and it's a different time.
Jerry, what can we expect as far as the vote counting process in Duval County and also in the state of Florida?
Well, I tell you, one thing the United States should look at is how Florida does their elections. And I say that because as many of them won't start counting their vote-by-mail ballots until after election night, we must report in the state of Florida all vote-by-mail ballots, all early votes by 7:15 on election night. So as you see right here, 55% of the vote will be out at 7:15. And then the rest, up to about 99% of the vote, will be done that night. All we'll be waiting for is our overseas military, which gets an additional 10 days, and going through our provisional ballots. So we'll have this thing wrapped up in Florida really before the night's over.
Well, Jerry, maybe last thing here. We know Florida legislature passed a series of laws since the last presidential election over these last 4 years regarding elections. How have those changed what happens in the elections office and during election season, what goes on?
Probably the biggest change and influence to the laws was vote by mail. From a standpoint, you have to renew it after every federal election. We saw a big downturn. We probably have half as many people voting by mail in this election than we did in 2020. Now again, 2020 had COVID, so a lot of people took advantage of vote by mail. But again, that's been one of the things. That's why we expanded early voting from 19 to 24 sites, because we knew many people didn't want to vote by mail, and we also wanted to take away the pressure of Election Day.
Jerry Holland, Supervisor of Elections in Duval County, thank you.
Appreciate
it. So one of the races that every Florida voter has on their ballot is the race for a U.S. Senate seat.
Former Republican Governor Rick Scott is seeking his second 6-year term in the Senate. His main challenger is Democrat Debbie Mucarsel-Powell, a former congresswoman from South Florida. News4JAX reporters Ann Maxwell and Tiffany Salome will be with the two campaigns tomorrow on election night. We begin tonight, though, with Ann in Southwest Florida in Bonita Springs. Ann?
Ashley, this is certainly a campaign with a lot of eyes on it. Senator Rick Scott, a familiar face to many Floridians. He has held statewide office representing Floridians for nearly 14 years now. He was first elected to the governorship in 2011, served 2 terms there before heading to Washington in the Senate in 2018. Now he's asking voters to send him back to Washington for another 6 years, and he's running on his Rescue America plan. Now that has 12 points, and number 1 on that agenda is education. Senator Scott is for school choice, teaching a pro-America curriculum, and eliminating the federal Department of Education, saying education is a state function. Number 2 on that agenda is colorblind equality. Senator Scott is looking to, quote, eliminate racial politics. Under his plan, he says no government policy will be based on race. Also on his proposal to voters, safety and crime. Senator Scott is calling for all laws to be enforced, as well as increased penalties for theft and violent crime. Scott is favored to win this race. Polling shows it may be within a few points. However, polling also suggests he's not as popular as former President Trump is with Florida voters. And again, he is going to be here watching the results come in tomorrow night at a local hotel. We'll be there covering it, and the senator is expected to speak after the race is called. For now, reporting live in Bonita Springs, Ann Maxwell, Channel 4, the local station.
Thank you, Ann. Senator Scott going to start his day, Election Day, tomorrow in Jacksonville. Thank you, Ann.
And Debbie Mucarsel-Powell won a four-way Democratic primary in August to advance to the general election.
In recent weeks, she's been joined on the campaign trail around the state by national figures from the Democratic Party. News4JAX reporter Tiffany Salome is in Miami, where Mucarsel-Powell will be tomorrow night. Tiffany?
We're in the Brickell neighborhood of downtown Miami tonight, and this is exactly where Debbie Mucarsel-Powell and her campaign will be setting up for an election night watch party as we wait for those results to come in. Until then, let's take a closer look at where she stands on the issues. Mucarsel-Powell is a former U.S. representative. She served Florida's 26th congressional district from 2019 to 2021. She immigrated from Ecuador at just 14 years old. Her platform focuses on reducing the cost of living and tackling inflation for Floridians. She also vowed to protect Social Security and Medicare programs and lower the cost of health care. On the topic of health care, she's campaigned for women's reproductive rights, criticizing her opponent, Rick Scott, heavily on the matter. Now, Florida voters get to decide tonight whether to keep Senator Scott or elect Mucarsel-Powell. We'll be here watching as the results come in. Reporting live in Miami, Tiffany Salome, Channel 4, the local station.
Tiffany, thank you so much. And for many members of Gen Z, this will be their first presidential election. They'll cast their ballots in, and both candidates have been focusing their campaign efforts on reaching those younger voters.
Yeah, so up next, two members of that age group join us to share their insights and how their peers are preparing for tomorrow's election. Our Vote 2024 special, The Road to the White House, continues after this short break. All right, well, this election season, we've seen the presidential campaigns reaching out to younger voters through things like TikTok, so with the popular internet personalities, and then embracing certain memes.
And a recent survey shows these younger voters, we're talking about the 18 to 29-year-olds known as Gen Z, they plan to make their voices heard. So the nationwide Harvard Youth Poll found that 58% of Americans in that age group say they will definitely vote, or they've already voted. Now, that number climbs when they believe that many of their peers will vote, with 79% saying they will definitely vote. So joining us now are two members of that age group, the Gen Zers, both students at the University of North Florida. We have Amelia Shepard, a UNF senior majoring in political science. Now, she is a registered Republican who first registered in high school as a Democrat, but then changed her party when starting college.
Yeah, also joined by Katie Renzi, a triple major in the class of 2025 in, let me see, sociology, political science, and interdisciplinary studies, also a registered Democrat. So let's begin here, and maybe Katie, you'd start for us. But what have you seen from the candidates when they're reaching out to folks in your age group? What are the themes? What are the messages they're using?
Lots of podcasts. I've seen definitely with Trump, his angle is sort of trying to be more personable, whereas Kamala Harris, she really wants to hit on the issues, and viewing sort of podcasts as like, you know, her one channel of getting to these young voters. And then I think also TikToks are definitely, you know, a source for, I haven't seen Trump as much, but definitely Kamala has a social media team that's working on those.
So what are you seeing in terms of enthusiasm for the election on campus and also among your peers? Amelia.
So on campus, I think I see a lot of enthusiasm about the election in general because we're in those political science classes, but young people are absolutely enthused about the election, and I think that coming up as close as we have to it, I've seen more people wearing their Kamala stickers or wearing their Trump stickers or talking more in conversations with each other about it.
Yeah, so Amelia, and hit on that first question we asked, what are the messages that you are hearing if they're targeted toward young Republicans on campus?
So there are young Republicans on campus, contrary to popular belief, but it is absolutely a discussion about Trump's policies, and I feel like there is a base in the Republican Party that is super enthused about his character more so than his policies, and I see more enthusiasm about what he's going to do good for the country more than maybe concerns, and I've had to pick up some of the concerns myself more recently, even though I'm still voting for Donald Trump. I think that the discussion has been a bit one-sided.
Yeah, and Katie, what are you seeing in terms of enthusiasm? The same as Amelia, or do you see it differently?
I would say it's really a lack of enthusiasm, if anything. Yeah, I like especially compared to 2020. I don't think that young people see this election as, you know, really speaking to them.
Wow. Now, I was not expecting that response. My goodness. Well, What's changed in your mind with this election over the past 5 months? Because we know so much has happened in the past 5 months with everything that's happened in the race. We'll start with you.
So nothing changed for me with the switch from Biden to Harris. I was always going to vote for Donald Trump, but especially coming up to Election Day, I've been weighing the pros and cons of each of them and realizing that the pros that are going to come with Donald Trump, I also am getting the cons of Donald Trump, and I've decided that that ultimately is the best decision for me to vote for him, but I think that's something important that people need to consider.
Are you saying that the pros for him outweigh the cons, in your opinion?
The cons for Harris and the cons for Donald Trump, I'm more comfortable with accepting the cons of having Donald Trump as our president than I would be with having the cons of Kamala Harris.
What about you, Katie?
I would say that my enthusiasm has been on a downward spiral since the DNC. I think the first month of campaigning, where she was really, going for the progressive base of the party, young people, putting out policies that would be of intrigue to them, I felt really pumped up, and a lot of my friends did too. And ever since then, her sort of pivot towards becoming more moderate and appealing to her Republican voters, it doesn't seem like she really cares about my vote. And in the end, as a protest vote, I didn't even end up voting for her. I voted third party.
The other side, though, of course, is going to say that she's still too far left, too liberal, too progressive. But you're not seeing that, at least in terms of what's happened since the DNC.
Yeah, I mean, she did a campaign appearance with Liz Cheney in the birthplace of the Republican Party. I don't know how you can appeal more to the Republican Party than that.
Interesting. So we did say a moment ago that a lot of Gen Zers are voting for the first time. Have you heard excitement about the first election that they're voting in, at least that?
So I was very excited about my first time voting. It was the first time. I didn't get to vote last time. I just turned 20 this past summer. But I haven't heard maybe that as much so than people are enthused, like I said. And I also kind of have an implicit bias with being in political science classes. People are enthused about it because they're interested in politics. Right. But I would say, no, I think I'm just excited in general for the election, so.
Yeah, I don't know about being excited to vote. This is my first presidential election. I voted in the midterms, but in me casting my ballot, I wasn't super stoked to go to the polls. Whereas I think in 2020, if I was eligible to vote, I definitely would have been more enthusiastic about it.
Katie and Amelia, really appreciate it. It's very helpful to see through your lenses there, to see how you're approaching this. Thank you so much.
Definitely.
And while much of the attention this year has been on the race for presidents, the balance of power in Congress, that is being very closely watched as well.
And Stacey Spanos has a look at where that stands and some of the key races.
Well, as of today, the Democrats hold the advantage in the U.S. Senate, 51 to 49. The 51 seats for the Democrats do include 4 senators who are independent, but they do generally vote with the Democrats. Now, this is where things will stand at the start of election night. 28 seats held by Democrats. They are not up for election, and 38 seats held by Republicans. Also not up for election. That's what the blue and red circles represent on that chart there. Now, the white circles in the middle, those are all seats up for election, and a slight change could easily tip the balance of power. So let's take a look at some of those critical races. We will start in Arizona, where Democrat turned independent Kyrsten Sinema is leaving the Senate. Democrat Ruben Gallego, a Marine Corps veteran, is running against Republican Carrie Lake, a former TV news anchor who ran for Arizona governor 2 years ago and lost. Election forecasters generally say this race leans Democratic. In Michigan, Democrat Debbie Stabenow is retiring. In the race are Democratic Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin and former Republican Congressman Mike Rogers. Some see this race as a toss-up. Others say it leans Democrat. Heading west to Montana, Democratic Senator John Tester is trying to hold on to his seat in a state that's become increasingly Republican. He faces Republican Tim Sheehy, a businessman and former Navy SEAL. This seat is seen as one that is likely to flip into Republican hands. In Nevada, Democrat Jackie Rosen is seeking re-election in a close race. She faces Republican Sam Brown, an Army vet who was badly burned when a bomb exploded in Afghanistan in 2008. Some forecasters say this leans Rosen's way. Others say it is a toss-up. Now to Ohio, and the race virtually everyone agrees is just too close to predict. Democrat Sherrod Brown hopes to hold on to his Senate seat. His Republican challenger is businessman Bernie Moreno. Pennsylvania Democrat Senator Bob Casey is seeking his 4th term. He faces Republican Dave McCormick, a former hedge fund CEO. McCormick ran for the Senate 2 years ago, but lost the Republican primary to Dr. Oz, who lost in the general election to Democrat John Fetterman. Most say this race is a toss-up. And in Wisconsin, Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin is seeking her 3rd term. She faces Republican Eric Hovde, a bank CEO. And this is another race that is just too close to call. We also want to briefly mention the balance of power in the House. Right now, Republicans control it with 220 seats to the Democrats' 212. There are 3 vacant seats. Every seat is up for election tomorrow, but only about 40 are considered toss-ups. And it's a close call as to who will have control when everything is decided. Back to you.
All right. Thank you, Stacey. All right, so we're going to bring in our roundtable for some perspective here. So, John Newman, when we look at the U.S. Senate race here in Florida, Rick Scott, boy, every race he's running is like that close.
Always.
I don't think just a few months ago people necessarily thought it was going to be close, and it seems like maybe it is this time.
Yeah, every time he runs close. So again, it comes down to turnout. Well, one of the benefits, of course, in Florida is that now there's a surplus of 1 million plus on the Republican side. So there should be some registration.
Plus, yeah.
So he should have some comfort in running. And it's funny to me how both of these campaigns are mirroring the national in terms of the messaging. You know, for Scott, it's on the economy, it's on immigration, it's on crime. Powell, it's on women's health and access to abortion. You know, so it's amazing how they mirror one another. And I think that, in a sense, we'll see kind of how the country is looking at this in terms of how the turnout is and what the decisions are.
Right, and John Newman brought it up a second ago. McCarcel Powell has put a heavy emphasis on the issue of abortion rights. We know Amendment 4 is on the ballot, and also her framing of Scott's position. Rick, is that likely to help her? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes. I think
simple.
I think it does. You have 10 states around the country that have actually put abortion-related amendments on the ballot. And I think it helps on the Democratic side and the Harris side for a couple reasons. One is turnout, turning out your voters, the Democratic base. But other is women and the gender gap, because it's important, and younger voters. So it does matter. But I want to step back for a second to talk about how important this is. The map in the Senate is really important because this is the year that favors the Republicans. You have 34 races, and 23 of them the Democrats are defending, and that means that many more opportunities for Republicans to pick up a seat. They expect to pick up West Virginia, likely to pick up Montana, and then battles in Ohio and in the Big Blue Wall. So you come into Florida in a race that could potentially be much closer than anticipated. But as John mentioned, there's over 1 million registrations now favoring the Republicans. That's a sea change. Demographics have changed in Florida. I miss all the candidates coming here as they used to when we were a battleground state. We're not considered that now. But this could be a little bit closer than anticipated, in part because of what you just mentioned, the amendments and who they bring to the polls, turnout, and that could be advantage to Kamala Harris and in the U.S. Senate race.
Yeah, Chris, this is interesting because I think what we've seen is that just the voters who say yes for Donald Trump don't always say yes for whoever that Republican is down ballot. Is there a disconnect? Even some of the things that John just mentioned about how the messaging for Rick Scott, he could say the same thing as Donald Trump, but maybe it's not perceived the same way.
Well, we're actually seeing that in state after state after state. All of these Senate races that Stacey just covered are situations where Donald Trump is running ahead, even if by just a couple of points, the Republican Senate candidate. So there is that gap, and I think there'll be a gap here in Florida as well. But just to put this in perspective, and John just sort of referred to Rick Scott's electoral history, let's review that for a second. In 2010, he won the governor's race by 1%. In 2014, he was reelected governor by 1%. In 2018, he was elected to the U.S. Senate by 10,000 votes. So if he wins by the margin the polls are suggesting, somewhere between 3 and 6 points, that's a landslide for Rick Scott. But I think, again, also shows the power. Florida has not completely lost its swing state status. I think you can still run a competitive contest here. But again, because of the voter registration numbers that Rick and John and Ashley talked about here, it does make it very difficult. The other thing that makes it difficult is the voter turnout infrastructure. Republicans have been building that machine for years. They have a very well-oiled system of getting voters to the polls. In recent years, because Florida has lost that swing state status, national Democrats just aren't investing in the state in the same way. So that's one big advantage the Republicans have, a machine to get their voters to the polls before and during Election Day.
And there's also something else that can happen in this particular term, and that is that Republicans have an opportunity to kind of split the baby, so to speak, no pun intended, in that they can vote for Rick Scott and at the same time vote for protection of women's health. It's an amazing proposition, but it could happen.
Because of the amendment.
Because of the amendment. That's exactly right.
All right. Well, many of the campaign ads we've seen here in Florida in the last few months have had little to do with the candidate. They've been about proposed constitutional amendments, as we talked about.
Yeah, there are 6 of these questions on the Florida ballot this year. 2 of them have been getting most of the attention, though. Amendment 3, that seeks to legalize recreational marijuana for adults 21 and up and establishes possession limits for personal use. This question sponsored by the group Smart and Safe Florida and put on the ballot by petition signatures. Most of the funding for the group has come from Trulieve, one of the medical marijuana dispensaries operating in the state.
Amendment 4 deals with abortion access and changing the state constitution to say that no law can restrict or prohibit abortion before viability or when necessary to protect the patient's health. This was also placed on the ballot through petition signatures. Now, the measure was sponsored by the group Floridians Protecting Freedom.
All right, and we come back to our roundtable here to discuss these 2 proposals. Worth pointing out, these proposals have to get 60% approval to pass. Polling shows that they are kind of in that range. So, Rick, both of these pass, both of these fails. One gets in, one doesn't. What's going to happen?
Well, my crystal ball is often flawed, but you did mention the 60% threshold, and that is a pretty big bar. If you're taking a look at the polling, I think it was assumed early that both would pass by a pretty good margin. Now it appears they're a little closer. In the end, I do expect both to pass. You've seen a lot of money spent on both sides. When it comes to Amendment 3 and the marijuana, a lot of unanswered questions. Can you regulate later on? How much money does it raise for local government? What will be the impact on crime? And you've seen police officers on both sides of this issue very hotly contested. On Amendment 4, I think this is one where the Republicans, quite frankly, and I'm saying this politically, overplayed their hand. Because if you take a look at the national politics, in the first 3 months, there's sort of a national consensus of pro-choice. In the last 3 months, there's sort of a national consensus of pro-life. It's that middle trimester that is where the difference has been. And Florida was at 15 weeks in that middle trimester, the exact same 15 weeks of Mississippi that was approved by the U.S. Supreme Court. But then they changed it from 15 weeks to 6. That got the passions up of many people. That's where the Amendment 4 ballot comes. And although there's been a hotly contested campaign, it's going to be very, very close on that issue. For the Republicans, such as Rick Scott, we mentioned it earlier, such as Donald Trump, that drives turnout, I think, more on the Democratic side. And so both of these amendments could very well pass, but it'll be a little bit closer than some people thought.
And talking about these amendments, we know we've seen Governor DeSantis holding events about opposing Amendment 4. We've also seen his wife, the First Lady, running ads opposing Amendment 3. You know, and I believe the governor even came here for one of his events on this issue. But is it unusual to see a governor talking about these issues in this way, these amendments?
It's not unusual to see a governor talking about amendments. That often happens when constitutional amendments are on the ballot. What is unusual is to see the state of Florida spending taxpayer money to quote unquote educate voters about the amendment. And that's been one of the big controversies actually in this election. The state has spent $50 million on opposing Amendment 3 alone, additional amounts on Amendment 4. There's also been controversy because the Florida Department of Health threatened television stations that ran ads in support of Amendment 4 until a federal court, Judge Mark Walker in Tallahassee, enjoined that practice. So that's been one of the huge controversies about the amendment, not just the involvement of the governor and others opposing the amendments, but also the involvement of taxpayer dollars. That is unusual. That doesn't happen. There have been many who have argued that's illegal. It's against Florida law and has become an issue itself in these amendment campaigns.
Yeah, whether it's illegal or not, many people still think unsavory, not good to see. We'll wrap up this discussion. What do you think? I know Rick just mentioned it a moment ago. Do you think that these 2 amendments will affect other races like the run for president or the Senate or what have you?
I think it's going to be an indicator as to where women are in this election cycle. because I think, as has been said in antiquity, hell hath no furies that of women scorned. I think women feel scorned on health care. The infant mortality and the maternal mortality rates are up since Dobbs. There's a reason why that is. The fetal anomalies take place after the 6th week, oftentimes after the 15th week. And so because women are under bans, they can oftentimes, as has happened recently, die or bleed out from just not being able to get health care. I think women are angry about that, and I do believe it's going to be something that is seen across the country.
Thank you, John.
All right.
All right, well, tomorrow night we're going to be tracking the race to 270, the number of electoral votes needed to clinch the presidency, and we're going to be watching which candidate reaches or surpasses that threshold.
But with 7 swing states, there are many different ways each candidate could earn 270 electoral votes. We're taking a look at some of the possible scenarios when our Vote 2024 special, The Road to the White House, continues.
All right, tomorrow night, all about the race to 270. That's the number of electoral college votes needed to clinch the presidency. So for 43 states and the District of Columbia, we got a pretty good handle on the outcome there.
But with 7 swing states in the balance, there are many, many possibilities. Here are a few different scenarios that could lead to a Harris or Trump victory. One of the most straightforward scenarios is for Harris to win the 3 Rust Belt states known as the Blue Wall. They are Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. If she also wins the 2nd congressional district in Nebraska, which is trending her way in the polls, this puts her right at 270 electoral votes, regardless of what happens in the 4 Sun Belt states.
All right, so on the other side, there's also a scenario that puts Trump at exactly 270 electoral votes. If he wins North Carolina, which he won in 2020, and flips Georgia and Pennsylvania from their 2020 Biden wins, then he would be right at 270.
And while there are other scenarios that lead to a Harris or Trump victory, we do want to mention this one. Unlikely, but possible scenario of an electoral college tie. Wow. There are different ways that it could happen, but if Harris wins the Rust Belt states and Trump wins the states in the Southeast and Southwest, plus Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, we are tied at 269. So this sends the election to the House of Representatives, where House members vote by state delegation. And since Republicans are expected to hold the majority of House delegations, this would likely lead to a Trump victory. It's very interesting and surreal to talk about a scenario like that.
Can you imagine? I mean, the way that this campaign has gone, especially in the last 6 months, maybe that's what happens.
Yeah,
it's unlikely, but maybe.
Exactly. So here we are on the eve. Who would you say, talk about momentum right now. Who has it?
Well, let me say this. This has been close all along, but there's been an ebb and flow in momentum. Certainly post the debate with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, Kamala Harris grabbed momentum. It began to wane. A couple weeks ago, I would tell you, you noticed an uptick in the momentum for Donald Trump. You saw it in the polls. And a couple weeks ago, you could see the confidence of the Trump campaign, and they really feel they had the edge. This past week, however, you've seen a little bit of a shift in the other direction, and the polling reflects that in favor of Kamala Harris. And then over the weekend, a little slowing on that, which all comes back to this. This is a very close race. How's that for being a profound statement? This is a very close race. It is one of the closest in U.S. history. Very likely could come down to those 7 states. Within the margin of error of 1 or 2 points, I think the Harris campaign feels very good about their position. I think, and for different reasons, they're looking to the early polling and they look to the women that are turning out. The Trump campaign feels very good about their position. They're looking to early polling and that the early turnout, and they've seen that low propensity voter turning out. But in answer to your question, there's been an ebb and flow on the momentum. Harris had it, Trump had it. Trump got that edge. Harris over the last week. As we sit here tonight, maybe a little bit of a slight edge in the momentum with Kamala Harris, but this race, I believe, is too close to call.
John, I just mentioned in our commercial break that I thought, hey, we should talk about this. There is a pretty interesting gender gap depending on or determining who people are going to vote for. Most women are saying, it seems in polling, yeah, I'm gonna vote for potentially the first woman president.
Yeah, there's an actual 34% gender gap. 18% more men for Trump, 16% more women for Harris. The question is, because the electorate is 53% generally women over men in the broader electorate, what kind of turnout? Once again, it comes down to turnout. And it also comes down to whether, and we've seen commercials about this, whether some women are going to go into that voting box and check for Harris but not telling anybody because they don't want to have arguments at home with their friends, with their church members, or whatever the case may be. So that is, I think, going to be maybe a silent factor that cannot be polled. It's going to be interesting. Yeah.
So, Chris, from your observation, what's proving to be most effective for the candidates in the final weeks, the final days, the final hours? Is it talking about issues or any other approach to reaching potential voters?
Well, Ashley, every election is a choice, and every campaign works very hard to define that choice in the minds of the voters. What we've seen in some of this recent polling, and Rick is right, it has ebbed and flowed, but there have been a couple of interesting trends in the final days. I think part of the reason Kamala Harris seems to have a little bit of momentum here at the end is a surge among independent voters, particularly independent women, as John was just saying, and seniors, particularly female seniors. So that seems to be something that's influencing the election. Donald Trump's strategy is very consistent. It's been consistent every election in 2016, 2020, and now, speaking to his base voters, trying to achieve high turnout to make sure that low propensity voters, voters who don't cast ballots in every election, come out and vote for him. So it's been a pretty clear strategy on both sides, really, for the last several weeks. We'll find out tomorrow which strategy was ultimately more effective in ensuring that turnout that will decide who the next president of the United States
I sure
is.
hope we'll find out tomorrow.
I sure hope so. Tomorrow or this week.
Right,
yeah.
right.
Or maybe this month. Yeah.
Thank you. Chris, Rick, John, thank you, and stand by.
Absolutely. So our Vote 2024 special, The Road to the White House, is coming to an end.
Yeah, after the short break, our roundtable will share some final thoughts to get you ready for Election Day.
If you have not voted just yet, head to our voters guide on News4JAX.com. You'll find the candidates on the ballot and the responses to our candidate questionnaire. We also break down the amendments and other ballot questions that you'll see. It's at News4JAX.com/voters guide. And tomorrow night, we'll have results for all the races with key information right there on the homepage.
All right, we're going to start to my right. John Newman, final thoughts. What are you looking for ahead of election night tomorrow?
To see whether the Trump campaign was participating in a total head fake. I think they never really wanted to go after folks in the middle. I think that they had numbers and algorithms, metrics on those low propensity male voters and decided that's what they were going for. And tomorrow we will see whether that paid off or not.
Instead of anybody in the middle.
Yes.
Fascinating.
All right, Chris, final
Well,
thoughts.
my final thought is I just want to urge people to exercise the most fundamental right of citizenship, and that's voting. You know, we had the supervisor of elections here earlier. You know, tomorrow's the last chance. Polls are open in the state of Florida from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. at your neighborhood voting precinct. If you don't know what that is, go to DuvalElections.com or whichever county you live in. This is the most important act we make as citizens in a democracy. There are two candidates with very different visions. People can vote however they want, obviously, but please, please take that time to vote if you haven't already. That's the power of citizenship.
I appreciate that. And Chris, Rick?
Two quick thoughts. One, as we sit here on election eve, tomorrow the election results will be historic. It'll be unlike anything we've seen in American history. If Donald Trump wins, he'll not only be the oldest president, surpassing the current incumbent, but this will cap off really the greatest political comeback in U.S. history if he were to win. It would be dramatic, nothing like it. If Kamala Harris were to win, she'd be the first woman ever to be president of the United States, the first woman of color ever to be president of the United States. So regardless of the outcome, and I hope the whole country rallies around whoever wins, it will be historic. The second comment, or the second thought is, it is consequential. This goes to Chris's thing about voting. It is consequential. They have different personalities, but they also represent different stark policy choices. Tax policy, immigration policy, foreign policy, you name it, there's a stark contrast in how they want to approach the future. So with Chris's comment to turn out, we're on the eve of something historic, and we're on the eve of something very consequential.
Yeah. And I'm very excited that you're going to be with us for doing all this. Tomorrow night, we want to make sure that you join us for our special Vote 2024 election night coverage. We're going to be right back here. We're going to start at 7 p.m. That's when the polls close, and we'll have results, analysis, live reporting, and we'll be here throughout the night. You'll see us on Channel 4, News4JAX.com, and News4JAX Plus. Thank you so much for joining us for our Vote 2024 special, The Road to the White House.
We'll see you in an hour for the 10 o'clock news.